am Dan Gressett, principal at Ruston High School. It is an honor to welcome Ambassador Clint Williamson this morning. While he currently teaches at Georgetown University, he has held leadership roles of overseeing investigations and prosecuting atrocity crimes committed at the end of the war in Kosovo. He also led diplomatic and policy efforts to prevent and respond to mass atrocities globally, serving in both administrations of Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Prior to his service internationally, he served as a federal prosecutor in the organized crime and racketeering section of the U.S. Department of Justice and as an assistant district attorney in New Orleans. Ambassador Williamson is a graduate of Louisiana Tech University and Tulane University School of Law. Most importantly, he is a Ruston High School Bearcat. Welcome home, Ambassador Williamson.
Appreciate it. I'm not quite as tall as you, so I'm going to have to move this down. So thanks, Dan, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Ruston, see so many former classmates from Ruston High, a lot of old friends, some old teachers. But most of all, it's a great privilege for me to have this opportunity to speak to those of you who are students here at the high school right now. I have spoken many, many times at universities around the world. Currently, through my affiliation at Georgetown, I engage with law students and undergrad students on a daily basis. But there's something very special about having a conversation with students from the town in which I grew up, share a similar background to me, and who attend the same school from which I graduated. So as I said, this is a real privilege. I haven't been back in this building in a long time. Feels very familiar. Must say it looks great, actually much better than I remembered. But it's also really gratifying for me to be here in a year when Ruston won the state football championship. So it's one of the miracles of modern life that no matter where you are in the world these days, you can follow events from thousands of miles away in real time. And so I was actually in Ukraine the night that Ruston was playing for the state championship. And even with an 8-hour time difference, so I got up at about 4 in the morning in Kyiv and started following the score. I think it's a pretty safe bet that I was the only one in Ukraine tracking Ruston High football that night. But in any event, I was glad I was able to do it. So congratulations on a fantastic season and a huge accomplishment. But turning to the business at hand, what I wanted to do today is talk to you a little bit about my career path, how I went from being a student like you here at Ruston High to work in Washington and a lot of places internationally, and to mention some of the issues that I've worked on along the way. Then I'd like to tell you a bit about the work I'm doing currently with Ukraine, and hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for questions. But first of all, I was born and raised here in Ruston. I went to A.E. Phillips for primary school, was here for 4 years of high school. As Dan said, I went to Louisiana Tech for my undergraduate studies. So I had a Ruston education through and through. After I graduated from Tech, I was fortunate to be admitted to law school at Tulane, moved to New Orleans for my legal studies. And when I finished law school there, I decided I wanted to stay in New Orleans. I ultimately got a job at the DA's office working under the then district attorney, Harry Connick Sr. And so I worked as an assistant DA for 5 years in New Orleans. Got a lot of trial experience, and my last position was chief of homicide in that office. While I loved New Orleans, enjoyed the work I was doing, I was interested in trying something different, and I also wanted to broaden my horizons. I had spent virtually my entire life in Louisiana and thought I'd like to do something a little bit different. So I started looking for jobs as a federal prosecutor, and eventually, after a very lengthy application and screening process, I got hired by the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, working in the organized crime and racketeering section. So I was based in D.C., but doing cases all over the country. And ended up doing trials in New Orleans, in Philadelphia, in Las Vegas, and really just had a great experience working with U.S. attorneys' offices and FBI agents, DEA agents, ATF agents around the country. But after I'd been at the Justice Department for about a year and a half, the criminal division, which is where my section fell, sent out an email. And just to put this in perspective, email was a new thing at that time. We had just gotten computers in the Department of Justice about 6 months before that. So up until that time, everything was done with pen and paper or on a typewriter. So even having computers was new, email was very novel. But anyway, they sent out an email just saying they were looking for prosecutors who might be willing to go to the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, which had just been set up in The Hague, Netherlands at that point. And so I put my name in for this job, and I thought I had no chance at all of getting this. I was very junior in the department. I knew of over 100 people that were applying for 2 positions, and all of them had a lot more experience than I did. But as it turned out, I had exactly the type of experience that they were looking for. I had this history of doing violent crime and organized crime prosecutions, and just by chance, I had traveled with a couple of friends and backpacked through what had been Yugoslavia a year before the war started there. So I had familiarity with the place that really no one else in the department had. But because of these factors, as you probably guessed, I did end up being selected by the Justice Department to go to the tribunal, which is known by its initials ICTY. And I actually arrived there 30 years ago next month. So I was the first American prosecutor to go to work in an international tribunal since the Nuremberg trials in Germany after the Second World War. And this has been a long time ago, and I'm sure most of you probably don't know much about it, but the wars in the former Yugoslavia that went on from 1991 to 1999 were the first major conflicts in Europe since the end of World War II. And over 100,000 people, mostly civilians, ended up being killed in Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo. These wars were the Ukraine and Israel-Gaza conflicts of the 1990s and really captured the world's attention. But because these wars were characterized by horrific war crimes, there was a lot of pressure for the global community to respond. And the establishment of the ICTY, which was really driven by the US, was an attempt to do that, to try to ensure accountability for those who were committing these terrible crimes. So I was posted to The Hague for what was supposed to be a 1-year assignment, but I ended up staying there for 7 years. And while I felt like I was better prepared for the work than many of my colleagues based on my prior experience, it was a very different undertaking from anything that I had ever done up until that point, investigating and prosecuting war crimes in the context of an ongoing war. So for the first time in my life, I found myself in situations where I was having to shelter from artillery fire and alter my movements around places to avoid snipers. Although I was based in the Netherlands, I spent about half my time on the ground in Croatia, then Bosnia, and finally in Kosovo. And I did a lot of things that I never imagined I would be doing, such as supervising the exhumations of a mass grave. One of the most interesting things I did was design a plan to lure a suspected war criminal across the border from Serbia into Croatia. We had this very involved plan that worked flawlessly. He did come across the border. We were able to have him arrested using Polish Special Forces soldiers who were part of the UN peacekeeping mission there. And as I said, everything went great. The Poles did an excellent job. They searched him, searched everything. We then put a hood on his head, handcuffs on him, bundled him off to an airplane, a Belgian Air Force plane, to fly to The Hague. And as we were going, he kept asking for his briefcase and saying, I have some documents in there that I would like to look at. And the briefcase was under my feet on the plane, and I was just saying, no, it's fine, you don't need it, you'll get it back later. So anyway, we arrived in The Hague. As they were taking him in to process him at the detention center, his bag goes through security and they found a pistol in there. So had he been able to get access to this briefcase, it might have ended very differently. I probably wouldn't be here speaking to you today. But anyway, it was the first time international forces had ever arrested an indicted war criminal. And it then sort of was really a breaking point for the tribunal, because this then opened the door for lots of other arrests that came after that. But during my time at ICTY, I led the investigations and prosecutions of 7 very large war crimes cases. And one of these, I would say perhaps the most important, was doing the indictment against Slobodan Milosevic, who was then the president of Serbia. And this is the first time that an international tribunal had ever indicted a sitting head of state. So this was quite significant as well. And I think we were able to make some huge strides in the field of international justice. But I left ICTY in spring of 2001 to go back to the Department of Justice. And I'd only been back a couple of months. I was back at the organized crime section, and I got a call from the State Department asking if I would be willing to go to Kosovo. And after the war in Kosovo, which had been a province of Serbia, the UN had taken over government there. And so the UN was still running different parts of the government. And the State Department wanted to know if I would go and serve effectively as the Attorney General of Kosovo, or the Minister of Justice in European parlance. So I ended up going out there, running their Department of Justice, running the court system, the prosecution service, the prison system, and spent a little over a year there. And then the Department of Justice asked me to come back to Washington, and I was going to be assigned to the White House. So specifically, I was to be posted to the National Security Council, which is a group of around 75 to 100 government officials, many of them from the State Department, the Defense Department, CIA, and Department of Justice, that work under the President's National Security Advisor and coordinate policy on international relations, on national security, and advise the President, do analysis on this, and really support the White House in the conduct of foreign policy. So I started at the White House in January 2003 during President George W. Bush's first term. Initially, I was assigned to the Counterterrorism Directorate. And so my position there, I was Director for Transnational Threats. So I was dealing with international arms smuggling, drug trafficking, international organized crime, and certainly terrorism issues as well. I'd only been in this job for about a month, and the State Department called again and asked this time if I would be willing to go to Iraq. And at a certain point, I should have learned not to take calls from the State Department. But in any event, they wanted me to go to Iraq in a very similar capacity as to what I had done in Kosovo, to go there and run the Ministry of Justice right after the U.S. invasion was going to take place, which was pretty much lined up for the following month. I wasn't eager to go. I had just spent the last 8 years in the Netherlands and then in Kosovo. And so I was a bit resistant to this, but I ended up speaking with Condoleezza Rice, who was then the National Security Advisor. And I sort of made my case, and she said, I get it, I understand you've been away, you just got home, you want to stay. She goes, but I really think you should go. So it's very hard when the National Security Advisor tells you that, so I went. But she was kind enough to accommodate me and say that I only had to stay for a few months. So I went in the second group of civilians to go into Baghdad right after the U.S. invasion. And at that point in time, there was still a lot of fighting going on and combat between U.S. forces and what was left of the Iraqi army. The first meeting I did with the leadership of the Ministry of Justice, the minister had gone, but otherwise kind of the mid-level senior managers were there. And so I was being effectively imposed on them as their new boss, as the Minister of Justice. So I had this first meeting, and there was a firefight going on about 2 blocks away, and we could just hear the ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, the gunfire. And I had a squad of American soldiers that was providing security, a 22-year-old lieutenant who kept saying, sir, I think we should go, I think we should go. And, but anyway, the fighting ended up getting suppressed and went on with the meeting. And, but this was the nature of doing work there. And the task was monumental. we were trying to put together and make functional this ministry again after Saddam Hussein's rule, after the U.S. invasion. And it was on a scale that was so much larger than what I had done in Kosovo. Kosovo is the size of Connecticut. It has 2 million people. Iraq is the size of California, has 25 million people. So instead of supervising 1,500 people in the ministry in Kosovo, I was supervising 30,000 people and trying to make all of this work in a security situation that was quickly deteriorating. And within a few weeks, we got to the point where as we started traveling around to meetings, you were getting shot at in these convoys. I mean, we were in armored Humvees, but still, I mean, you know, it's not a good feeling when you hear bullets pinging on the shell of the car. I ended up coming back as I was supposed to Washington, and a week after I left Baghdad, there was this horrific bombing of the UN headquarters building there. And I lost a number of friends in this bombing. Because I had been in the UN in Kosovo, I really had and also at my time at the ICTY, I had made a lot of connections in the UN. Both of those were UN agencies. And so I was kind of the go-to person for the UN in Iraq. They knew me. So in the US mission, I was the person that they were dealing with the most. And I had been in this building many times and had been there only a week before I left. And then, as I said, unfortunately it was destroyed and a lot of very good people died. But it was a real turning point, I think, in the security situation then in Iraq. But when I came back to Washington, I went back to the White House, back to the National Security Council, and while I was still in the Counterterrorism Directorate, I ended up getting shifted more and more into dealing with Iraq, and eventually got reassigned to the Defense Policy Directorate at NSC as Director for Stability Operations. So in this position, I worked very closely with the senior military and civilian leadership at the Pentagon, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also with the combatant commands of the U.S. military around the world. After President Bush was reelected, they did some restructuring, and I was moved over. I became a special assistant to the president and senior director for relief, stabilization, and development. So in this role, I was overseeing U.S. government responses to crises around the world. So the initial response, right after a crisis would occur, whether it was a natural disaster, a civil war, something like that, then the stabilization effort that followed that, and ultimately the long-term development, which was often done through the World Bank or International Monetary Fund. But just as an example of something we were doing very close to the end of my time there was one weekend, there was this horrific volcanic eruption in Indonesia, Mount Merapi, on the southern part of the island of Java, and many people were killed. It just devastated this whole area of Indonesia. China moved very quickly to respond to this, to provide humanitarian assistance. The United States wanted to do the same thing. I mean, we had strategic partnerships with Indonesia, but this is part of this winning of hearts and minds. You know, if the people who are suffering see all this Chinese assistance coming in and say, where's the United States in this, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth. So President Bush wanted to move very quickly to respond to this. He happened to be at Camp David that weekend, and so I was in Washington, but talking regularly with the National Security Advisor then, Steve Hadley, and with the Admiral who was in command of the Pacific Command in Honolulu. And so we were trying to move naval vessels from all over the Pacific, all over the Indian Ocean, to bring assistance there, to help the Indonesians stabilize the situation. So this is the kind of thing that goes on a day-to-day basis, where we're trying to manage these issues all over the world. You have lots of different people with different responsibilities, but you know, there's much of this that is happening on a daily basis. But with the start of President Bush's second term, Condoleezza Rice, who had been National Security Advisor, moved over to the White House, to the State Department as Secretary of State. And so she asked if I would be willing to come there and to serve as Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues. It's now called Global Criminal Justice. you may not know have even heard of what an ambassador at large is. So when you think of an ambassador, you generally think of our diplomats that are running our bilateral embassies in a foreign capital. So our embassy in Paris, for example, and our ambassador is dealing with the French government, managing that relationship. But we also have a number of ambassadors at large that are based in Washington that have global portfolios. So on issues like global criminal justice, global women's issues, climate change, counterterrorism, these are issues that don't fit neatly into a bilateral relationship, so you have a global portfolio. The good side of this is that you have one person who's a focal point for this and their offices that run these issues. The bad part of it is you are managing a global portfolio. So although I'm in Washington, I was having to travel all the time. I spent about 2 weeks out of every month traveling around the world. But as Dan said, I ended up serving the last 2.5 years of the Bush administration and the first year of the Obama administration in this role. Traditionally, the ambassador for global criminal justice, the primary responsibility was trying to prevent mass atrocities from happening around the world, bringing military, civilian, intelligence assets to bear to try to prevent these things from occurring. If you're not successful in that, then it's in managing the response to these mass atrocities and ensuring accountability for those who commit crimes. But another part of the job that my predecessor had volunteered for after 9/11 was to also take on responsibility for negotiating transfers of detainees out of the Guantanamo detention facility. So, as I said, I inherited this and spent a lot of my time traveling around the world trying to either get detainees back to their home countries or to third countries. But it's a very complicated process. It wasn't just take your person back. It was trying to put in place security arrangements to make sure that whatever threat this terrorist posed would be mitigated so that we would make sure that they would not go back and re-engage in terrorist activity. So I spent a lot of time, particularly in the Middle East, doing this, a lot of time in South Central Asia, places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. One critical trip I did was very early in the Obama administration with John Brennan, who was then the Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, but soon thereafter to become Director of Central Intelligence. And we ended up going to Saudi Arabia, meeting with King Abdullah, to Yemen with President Saleh, who was later assassinated. But we were trying to work out a deal for what to do with the Yemeni detainees at Guantanamo, which has been one of the most problematic groups and still is, unfortunately. So this was a fascinating job, but just an exhausting workload, and as I said, the travel was overwhelming. After my term as ambassador ended, I served with the UN as a special envoy to Cambodia, again, sort of on behalf of the US government. Then in my last job in government, I was a special prosecutor for the European Union in Brussels, but again, through the United States government. So officially assigned to the US Embassy in Brussels, but working at the EU. I retired in 2014 from full-time service in the government, but I've continued in a part-time arrangement, as they often do with former ambassadors, and as senior advisor to the Bureau for European Affairs. But in going through all this, I wanted to give you a flavor of the type of work I've done, but also just to show you how different it turned out to be from what I imagined my career would look like when I was a student here at Ruston High, or even working in New Orleans. And my point is that it's virtually impossible to map out what your career or your life is going to look like, even though we often try to do that. And we try to game out these things like, well, if I do this, it's going to lead to that. This is particularly prevalent in law school. I mean, it's like such a herd mentality in law school. You have to do this, you have to do that, and that will do this. But it doesn't always work out that way. And because there's just so many variables in life that it is impossible to predict what one thing is going to lead to or another. So my advice is really just to follow your interest. Take some chances and see where it leads. In my case, I think it led to some very interesting developments along the way. And in this regard, perhaps one other unexpected turn happened for me a couple of years ago, and that came in relation to Ukraine. So yet again, the State Department calls me and said, we would like for you to put together a team of people to work on advancing transitional justice in Ukraine. This was in 2021. So at that point, we were focused on war crimes that had happened since Russia's initial invasion in 2014. And although you may not have followed it as closely, but certainly everybody's been attentive since the large-scale invasion in 2022. But this war has been going on since 2014. A lot of crimes had been committed and had not been dealt with. But I had started working on this and having some contacts with the Ukrainian prosecutor general, sort of their equivalent of the attorney general. And, but we didn't get a lot done in late 2021 because of COVID, because of the security situation. But as it became clear that Russia was going to invade with a full-scale invasion, we started trying to make contingency plans on how we might deal with that. And then on February 23rd, 2022, I woke up in my home in Washington. I had just this flurry of urgent messages from the then Prosecutor General, Irina Venediktova, and she said, can you do a call with me and my senior staff? So we quickly arranged a Zoom call that morning. And up until that point, they had actually been quite relaxed about the prospects of a Russian invasion, feeling like this really can happen. We've been dealing with the Russians for a long time. They're not going to do a full-scale invasion. But when I got on the call with them that morning, it was very different. They were clearly rattled. Their hands were shaking. Their faces were ashen. And she said, can you come out here and embed with our office? And as she said, show us how to do this. Because they knew that they were about to be inundated with all of these war crimes. And so we started working with the State Department. I was going to try to go to Lviv in the western part of Ukraine. But then the full-scale Russian invasion happened the next day. So I ended up going with a small team to Poland, and we set up in a village right on the Polish-Ukrainian border, started working with our Ukrainian prosecutor counterparts, and began an arrangement that has gone on uninterrupted since then. We worked in Poland through February, March, April of 2022, and then since June, we've been on the ground in Kyiv, in Ukraine. So as I'm speaking with you today, I have a team of prosecutors, investigators, analysts who are there right now working with our Ukrainian colleagues. In late May of 2022, what had started out as this US-only effort was joined by the European Union and the United Kingdom governments. I was appointed as the lead coordinator of this consortium that they call the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. So I report up to these three governments that serve sort of as a board of directors, and then going down, I coordinate 5 different organizations that are doing this work on the ground, and all of their prosecutors, investigators, and analysts. I go out to Kyiv about every 6 weeks. As I said, I was there in December when you were playing for the championship, but it's not easy to get there. Because of the ongoing war, you can't fly into Ukraine. So I ended up going to Krakow in Poland. So I fly from Washington to Krakow, overnight flight. Then you get in cars, and it's about a 12 to 15-hour drive from there to Kyiv. It's kind of like driving across Texas. It's like long distances, not a lot to see. But then Kyiv is a great city. And it's, it says something about the resiliency of the Ukrainians that they just are very determined to continue life as normal. There's traffic on the streets. There's pedestrians everywhere. Restaurants are open. Bars, cafes are full. Meetings go on as normal. But then at 3 in the morning, the air raid sirens go off, and they start lobbing, cruise missiles at you, and you have to end up going into a shelter. So a lot of times when I'm there, this happens every single night. And so your sleep is interrupted, maybe for 30 minutes, maybe for a few hours. But even on nights when you don't have attacks, you're always on edge waiting for when are the sirens going to go off. So you never get well rested. You're trying to work despite this. I'm able to come and go. Our Ukrainian friends have had to deal with this straight through for 2 years. So they're exhausted, but they're also incredibly committed to see this through. And I've seen horrific crimes in the Balkans, in places like Rwanda and Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Myanmar. But there are some things that are very different here that I've never seen before. One of them is the abduction of thousands of children that the Russians have been doing, where they are taking children, they are shipping them off to the far east of Russia, and they're placing them, Ukrainian children, and they're placing them with Russian families to Russify them, to make sure that they teach Russian, to start thinking of themselves as Russian, and to forget about their families. But you can imagine how horrible this is for their families who don't know where their children are, for these children who have no further contact with their parents. And we don't even know what the scale of this problem is. Another thing that I have never seen before is intentional targeting to try to do environmental damage in Ukraine, to make the country unlivable for the people that are there. So even if the Russians lose, they're trying to make sure that the Ukrainians who are determined to live freely will not be able to live in their homes, in their villages, in their towns. So there's a lot at stake in Ukraine. As I said, I'm now affiliated with Georgetown, so my work in Ukraine is actually done through the International Criminal Justice Initiative at Georgetown, which I head up. And it's a platform for this, but it's also a vehicle for doing these kind of responses in the future if it proves necessary. So just to wrap up, I want to leave you with 3 suggestions, and I hope you'll take some of these on board. 2 of them are quite general, and 1 is a bit more specific. But first of all, I would just urge you to cultivate a sense of curiosity and to pursue the things that you're interested in. As you may have picked up, I didn't exactly follow a conventional career path for a lawyer. But as I said earlier, what I did do was seek out jobs or opportunities that I thought seemed interesting. They were rarely as lucrative as many of the jobs that my classmates from Tulane Law School took at big firms. And none of them seemed at the time like things that would necessarily lead to other promising jobs or more prestigious jobs. I was fortunate that most of the things I did worked out really well and opened doors to other opportunities. But even if they would not have, I would have still had an amazing career from my perspective because I was able to do things that I found interesting and that I enjoyed doing. This gave me incredible job satisfaction in every position I've had since I graduated from law school. And I can honestly say, every single job I had, I looked forward to going to work every morning. And that's not a small thing. But ultimately, my whole career track was shaped by being curious and following my interests. Secondly, don't put limitations on yourself. Don't ever think, I'm from a small town in Louisiana, or I don't have the right connections, or I didn't go to the right college, or whatever things that, sort of are weighing on you. There may be times that factors like this do play a role, but I think it's very rare, and I think it's often much, much less than people tend to imagine. For example, right now I have 2 research assistants that are students at Georgetown Law School who are supporting our work in Ukraine. One of them is from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and the other one is a girl who went to middle school in Baton Rouge, and she ended up moving to Texas after that. They are great, and I think they have a very promising career. And as I've gone around the country, I've often, heard from people, oh, well, these kind of things are for people that went to Harvard or went to Yale or from the, only if you grew up in kind of the Washington to Boston corridor. But that's not true. The government, this world is full of people who came from all over the country, from towns like Ruston. So again, don't put limitations on yourself. I didn't graduate anywhere near the top of my class at Tulane. I put in lots of applications for jobs before I got one at the DA's office there in New Orleans. As I turned out, it was a great fit for me. Likewise, when I put in my name for this opportunity to go to the Yugoslavia Tribunal, I thought there was no chance I was going to get selected. but I ended up getting chosen, and it put my career on a completely different trajectory. So take a chance on things you're interested in. You have nothing to lose by trying. And finally, on a more specific note, I would encourage all of you to think about careers in public service, whether it's in the federal government or in your local community. I started out, as I said, working as a state prosecutor in New Orleans, and it was incredibly rewarding. But whether it's as a prosecutor, a police officer, a public defender, a firefighter, a paramedic, you do get something out of giving back to the place you live. At the federal level, where I unexpectedly ended up spending most of my career, I had incredible experiences that I would not trade with anyone with whom I went to law school. I had the privilege of working with so many dedicated people who were absolutely committed to their jobs and to serving this country in the military, as diplomats, as intelligence officers, as prosecutors, as law enforcement agents, and most of them do it for less pay than in the private sector, often working long hours and in very difficult environments. But serving your country is a privilege, and for me at least, I feel that it's paid huge dividends in return. So I'll stop there with my remarks, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have or just delve further into any of the things I've talked about.
We do have an extra microphone available. If anyone has a question, I can bring you a mic. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns?
Criticisms?
Criticisms?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. Go ahead.
This is my wife. I had to come to her first.
Good decision.
Was there a class that you took in particular, like in high school or college, that you feel like best prepared you for your career or interacting with all the people you've encountered?
Well, obviously, I've got to say Gary Green's history class here, American history.
Good answer.
I had great teachers in Ruston, at A. Phillips, here, at Louisiana Tech. And, I say that only half jokingly. I mean, Gary was a fantastic teacher. And, Virginia Cook, who taught civics for me, I think was an excellent teacher as well here at high school. Likewise at Tech, I majored in political science. I thought I wanted to go into law, but it also laid the groundwork for a lot of what I ended up doing down the line, although that was not, I didn't expect this career track, as I said. So I think, I had a very solid education here. I did an interview with Kathy Cox-Boniol at The Leader last week, and I said, maybe when I was in school here, I did not recognize it as much, and certainly, just didn't acknowledge it if I did recognize it. But how good this education was that I got here at this school, at Phillips, at Louisiana Tech. And so only it was after time passed that I came back to see that. But I think it was definitely a factor in success. But you have to apply yourself. You get out of it what you put into it. So, I'm sorry, there was, yeah.
How did you develop the people skills to deal with all the different personalities and agendas and those sorts of things to get something done?
Yeah. That's a good question, and I'm not sure. No. It is. I mean, it's a valid question, and certainly as a diplomat, this is a critical part of your work, and a lot of times you are dealing with interlocutors on the other side who are coming in with a very hostile point of view, and so you're trying to find some common ground that's a starting point for discussion. Sometimes you just have to agree to disagree. But in my time as ambassador at large for global criminal justice, I dealt a lot with the Russians and Chinese at the UN Security
about the post-traumatic stress and the, impact that would have on you psychologically. How did you